In 2017, I produced and presented a half-hour-long documentary for radio called After the Dawn. It was inspired by the autobiography of then Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams and his book Before the Dawn. Adams' book was published before the conflict had ended. I wanted to make a documentary exploring the journey former members of the IRA had made since peace was secured and the challenges they faced moving from war to peace. Former IRA volunteers today have a representative organisation that supports ex-IRA volunteers, and it's called COISTA, the Committee of Ex-Prisoners. COISTA represents around 24,000 former IRA prisoners across Ireland. In March 2017, I travelled to West Belfast to meet and interview senior members of the IRA. At the time, there was a political crisis in the peace settlement and ultimately unfounded concerns that the war may reignite. I made a number of interviews during the course of that documentary with conflict resolution experts and also victims groups, but the key focus for me was travelling to West Belfast to hear directly from IRA members themselves. In total, I interviewed 3 senior members of the IRA. And it was in that context that I met Seanna Walsh, who is currently a Sinn Féin councillor in Belfast, but is better known as a leading figure in the IRA. In 2005, it was Walsh who fronted a statement on behalf of the Army Council of the IRA, known in Irish as Oglan na HÉireann, confirming and directing all members of the Republican Army to stand down and to end their campaign.
The leadership of Oglan na HÉireann has formally ordered an end to the armed campaign. This will take effect from 4 p.m. this afternoon. All IRA units have been ordered to dump arms. All volunteers have been instructed to assist the development of purely political and democratic programmes through exclusively peaceful means. Volunteers must not engage in any other activities whatsoever.
Welsh remains a senior figure in the Republican movement, a former officer commanding within the IRA and a once close friend of Bobby Sands, the IRA commander who led the 1981 hunger strikes and who ultimately lost his life along with 9 other IRA men. I started by asking Walsh if the focus now for ex-prisoners was to follow the route established following the end of apartheid in South Africa and proceed with a truth and reconciliation process that may bring closure for victims and former combatants alike.
I would just like to let you know that a number of years ago, probably around 2014, COISTA did a bit of work on this with our client base, I suppose. We did a series of workshops with former IRA prisoners in West Belfast and North Belfast, in Derry, in South Armagh and in Tyrone. And in the main, people were comfortable with the idea of a truth recovery process. But there were a number of, shall we say, restrictions on that or conditions on that. And what people were saying was they would not be prepared to put themselves back into jail again. That's the first thing. The second thing was that they would not be prepared to engage in a courtroom style setup as you had in South Africa. What they were saying was where people had reached the position that people who had loved ones killed, if people were seeking answers as to, the circumstances or whatever about all of that, the killings during the conflict, and people wanted information on that to help bring closure to their own particular situation. In the main, the ex-prisoner says that they were quite comfortable with that. But they were, now not all of them were. Some of them were saying, look, whatever's happened has happened, and I'll not be prepared to talk about it to anyone. And
because there's a tradition in Irish republicanism of whatever you say nothing.
Yeah.
So.
And that's just a, as you say, it's a tradition. It's the way that people have always thought of it. That once the war's over, once the conflict's over, it's over, and that's it. But there was a general acceptance from the majority of guys that they would be prepared to help bring closure to people who were not able to get it any other way. So I would be confident that Republicans will participate in any process. But as I said at the start, guys don't see themselves ever being in a position where they're going to stand up in a dock and swear themselves back into prison again. And
a key element would have to be an amnesty, and there's no prospect of that. The British seem to have completely ruled that out, haven't they? Because they've got their own skeletons, of course.
Well, you see, you're saying that the key element would have to be an amnesty. That's not exactly true. There were a number of structures agreed to within the Fresh Start agreement 2 years ago. And, you know, one of those was an information recovery project whereby people could bring questions forward. Once those same people had accepted that they were unable to get any more information, that there would be a panel set up that could seek answers for them. That was agreed, but any information that was brought forward in that particular process would have to be firewalled against those who were seeking that information to use it in a judicial process to bring people before the courts. Now you might think that's a wee bit strange or outlandish, or there's no chance of anything like that ever happening. But that is exactly the type of process that currently exists to look at the recovery of the number of people who were disappeared during the conflict. That there's a panel set up. There is a Republican interlocutor, if you will, to whom people bring questions. The Republican goes and talks to former comrades, former IRA personnel, tries to get details in regards to the killings and burials of these people, and then brings it back to the panel. And that process is firewalled from prosecution. It doesn't matter what information is brought forward there, it cannot be used to put people in the dock.
But that process, I suppose, as well, doesn't really address the needs of former political prisoners either. It's a kind of... It allows...
And what way would you be seeking to address the needs of former political prisoners?
Well, the issue of giving them fair equality of rights to employment.
No. That will have to be a separate legislative process. And in regards to that would be fairly easily brought about if the political will was there to do that. That's not rocket science. What has to be done is that former Republican prisoners, former Loyalist prisoners also, have to be given the same protection under the anti-discrimination legislation as what everybody else is. You know, that's quite easy to do. That and there's a number of ways of doing that. You know, at the minute, all of the legislation regarding restrictions on jobs, restrictions on international travel, and the problems that former political prisoners have in and around house and car insurance, all of that can be resolved by having drawn a line in the sand and having a cut-off date of 1998, whereby the international peace accords were signed up to in the Good Friday Agreement. So, you know, rather than relying on RUC records from 1973 or 1975 or whatever, if people rely on the PSNI records since they came into being, you know, if there is a will to resolve this issue, there's a way of doing it. But unfortunately, what we have found with the political configuration within unionism at the minute, they are simply continuing to prosecute the war by different means, and they see the past and the narrative of the past as a way of attacking Republicans and undermining the Republican project.
For those who weren't directly involved in the war, how, for the younger generation in particular, how much does the nostalgia and romanticism that's associated with that, how much does that undermine the peace process, or does it?
Well, one of it's interesting that you've mentioned that, because one of the central tenets of the work that Cushton and Near Kimmy do here is to address that, to tackle that whole issue with the young people of today who have never known conflict. And so we would go into schools, we would go into youth clubs, we would engage with young people at every opportunity, and we would do it on the basis, like just last Friday, I was involved in that type of a project with young people from Derry City who came up to Belfast to do the Costa Tour, which takes in both the Falls Road and the Shankill Road. And after that, they were given the opportunity to talk to, to listen to, and to ask questions of myself as a former IRA prisoner, a former Loyalist prisoner, as you would expect, but also a former member of the British Army, where we talk about our past, we talk about our journey from right through the conflict into the peace process, and what we hope to achieve now that the conflict is over. And it's very important that young people have those sort of opportunities. And the thing about it all is that, you know, we do make a conscious effort, because we were very much involved in the conflict. We believe that we have a responsibility to ensure that now that the conflict's over, that young people don't become caught up in the spider's web being spun by some of these anti-peace process groups for their own ends. And so we would, at all opportunity, we would engage with them and try and tease all of these issues out. And one of the phrases that I would use is that we seek to de-glamorise the conflict that for some people, some keyboard warriors, if you will, would sit down on their computers and throw up YouTubes of the IRA funerals, IRA attacks on the British and all the rest of that, and use that as a way of drawing young people into their own sort of world of whatever it is they're actually trying to do, because it's not really clear to me what they're trying to do, but they're trying to recruit young people for their own ends, and so we would see it as being a central part of the work that we do to counter all that.
In any conflict with combatants, there's people experience a whole lot of different things that they can be damaged psychologically by the actions they carried out. Yeah. What kind of support is there for former political prisoners who've experienced that?
Interestingly enough, when we were in prison, as far as we were concerned, the only problems that we had were due to the fact that we were in prison, that as soon as the gates opened and we were released, that would be the end of all our problems. But in recent years, and as our cohort has got older, we have found that all sorts of different levels of psychological problems are emerging within our particular constituency. And we have had to set up a number of self-help organisations to try and deal with some of the aspects of this. We have set up a Still Imprisoned project, which attempts to look at the whole business of alcoholism and addiction to possibly gambling or addiction to prescription drugs and sometimes even street drugs, and try and help former comrades through all of that. We have tried to build a bridge, because there's a very deep suspicion within the Republican community about the statutory agencies, the agencies of government, and therefore even the likes of the health service and any mental health services which may be there, if they have the government sort of stamp on them, you'll find that they are less than welcome within sections of the Republican constituency. But we have attempted to build a bridge between those prisoners who are suffering and some of the agencies which we believe can help them. Now, that hasn't been easy, because according to the Terrorism Act 2000, any psychiatrist who treating a former political prisoner or a former volunteer in the Republican Army who discloses information in regards to operations that they may have been involved in, well, you're talking about 20, 30, 40 years ago, that these people can be cast into prison for what they were involved in. And therefore, we see that as being another legislative barrier. The same would not apply to former British soldiers who have been damaged by the conflict. But one of the other aspects of all of this is that we do find that more and more guys are seeking the services that, and it's you know, it's a fraction of what we feel that we should be doing, that we are doing, but we don't have any resources. We're not funded. We can't really provide the quality of service that we believe that our comrades require. And you know, we've talked about some of the stuff that they were involved in, but you have to remember that, you know, there were hundreds, thousands of former Republican prisoners and former Republican volunteers were actually abused and tortured in the interrogation centres and in the prisons themselves. So we're trying to deal with all of that, and I have to say it's becoming more and more of a problem.
And the political process is in a state of crisis at the moment. On top of that, we have the impending Brexit, the UK withdrawal from the EU. That's going to cause a big problem in terms of funding potentially as well, is it?
Well, it will. We don't know what the future holds in terms of funding. But, you know, we will just have to try and struggle through it. It's a bit of an indictment that, you know, that we haven't been able to put together any sort of a process that would lend itself to allowing the closure to be brought to the political ex-prisoner community and the former volunteers and stuff like that. Because we are aware that hundreds of millions have been spent on helping the former RUC personnel and former British soldiers to adjust. And if you talk to particularly former British soldiers, they will tell you that it's nowhere near what they would really require to help them readjust to the future and the end of conflict society that they find themselves in.
And generally, are the ex-political prisoners community, are they quite positive still about the peace process? I remember an interview many years ago with Brendan Hughes in which he was asked, is it worth it? You know, you've lost a lot of people, you've gone through a lot yourself. Is it worth it? I mean, do they still think it's worth it?
Well, in the main, I would say that the majority of guys, men and women, do believe that the struggle was worth it. But they are mainly people who are still wedded and hopeful that the political objective, you know, the new Ireland, the end of British involvement in this part of the country, they're still of the mindset that we are moving towards that. There are people who have become disgruntled and dissatisfied simply about the way that the conflict ended, about the treatment of the Republican volunteers who were involved in the conflict, and all of that. There are people who have become disgruntled, and for them it's a lot harder, you know. You mentioned Brendan Hughes there, and for me, the saddest comment that I ever heard from any former Republican prisoner was when Brendan said, "I wish he was back in jail again." You know, because in the prison, he knew exactly where he stood, and he had his comrades around him, and all of what was going on there. Out here, in the big bad world, it can be very different. So, you know, there are people who do find themselves isolated, particularly people who no longer espouse the hopes and aspirations for the Republic that they would have had, that actually led to them becoming involved in the Republican struggle. And the all of the trauma that comes with conflict, whether it's outside the prison or inside the prisons, all of that trauma can impact upon people to the extent that they find themselves divorced from their families, living on a pittance, looking out the windows of maybe a block of flats somewhere, and wondering, basically what happened, what was it all about. Whereas those of us who still have a political focus, who still have a reason for getting up in the morning to try and continue, to build the road to the Republic, we come at it from a very different sort of point of view.